I'm Kevin Lankus, and in my professional analysis of the current media environment and the cultural overview of the political landscape, both in America and abroad, the one thing that's most responsible for the polarization, radicalization, and general division in the United States right now is the ad revenue model of digital media. If you're skeptical about this, or you don't really know how that particular model encourages polarizing content, just hear me out. I promise I have the receipts. I have 15 years of experience creating media in both print and on the web, and I know exactly why America is so incredibly polarized right now. So if you're looking around at all the things and just feeling really confused right now, then I'm here to help. We're going to talk about that here today, and I'm going to tell you how it came about, why pretty much no one else is talking about it, and how some people have taken advantage of it to make themselves very, very rich, and what our options are for flipping the script on this whole thing going forward. The ad revenue model of digital media ensures that mainstream narratives about practically any event are reactionary and fear-based. They have to be in order to get views. This is an ad unit. There are a number of them across different types of content on the internet. They come with something called a CPM, which stands for cost per mille, mille being Latin for 1,000. This is the most tracked and vitally important metric to ad revenue that there is. There's lots more than that, but this is the first major obstacle to being seen on the internet and to getting paid. It means that you get a certain amount of money per every 1,000 clicks or 1,000 views of a particular ad unit on your content. So if your click-through rate pays out per 1,000 views, like it does in digital publishing, then you're going to want as many thousands of views as you can possibly get. And professional content creators, whether they be journalists or elsewhere in the larger world of media, are trained in how to pull people into a story. We workshop the hell out of headlines painstakingly before publishing anything. We work with ad ops teams to keep people engaged and glued to pages for as long as possible, because ad units also switch out in 30-second increments, which is the standard timing, but you can also tweak that. But time on page is really, really, really important because it determines how many ads people are seeing as they switch out one to the next. You're looking for thousands and thousands of people to stay glued to your piece for each of these ad cycles so you can make a lot of money. The more you succeed at this, then the more valuable your content becomes and the higher your CPM will climb. CPM is also heavily tied to niche or area of specialization. So for instance, business news or marketing how-tos are much more valuable to advertisers than, say, lifestyle news or your nephew's gaming channel. Even if your nephew is famous, all things being equal, certain niches will still draw in higher bids for space on their content. And all this happens automatically. There are exchanges out there where companies buy space inside ad units across the web within fractions of a second. At one time, you had a lot of what we call direct sales, where you'd have sales reps manually selling ad space, but now the vast majority is done through this automated process called programmatic advertising. In effect, as a content producer, what you're doing is navigating a series of robot gatekeepers. You'll hear a lot of people in the digital content realm talk about the algorithm. Every platform has its own, and they're all proprietary, and they're all programmed with rules about all kinds of little things. Any tiny detail can derail your chances of being seen on a certain platform. What this means is that content creators have an incentive to be as sensational as possible. And they do this in order to dominate the metrics and make the algorithm happy so that it pushes your content to more people. They also do this to overcome obstacles built into the algorithm so that people click and stay on your page even if the robots aren't altogether happy about something or other. All of this happens within reason because there's also a feature called brand safety built into advertising networks, and a lot of the time there are banned word lists and other tools that can keep really egregious content from being seen or from being monetized, but those aren't foolproof. When this whole change happened from an analog world to a digital one, multiple news networks were just flailing. Tons of content operations went under because they didn't know the first thing about how to be seen anymore in this vast digital void where everybody was pushing whatever they wanted. What happened eventually was that certain people figured out that sensationalism sells, and this has always been a pretty basic tenet of human consumer psychology. But at this point, it was now being applied to the wealth of human knowledge and the social information ecosystem. And I don't think I have to tell anyone that that's bad. So then you had the major news guys figuring this out and honestly simply just getting by on their name recognition alone until then, and then others like the New York Times and long-form journalism like the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Harper's, etc., continuing to use a subscription model in order to meet revenue goals. And that's the only other real option for digital media, but not everyone can do that, especially in the early days. No one was going to subscribe to your nephew's gaming blog back then. But the ad revenue model allowed for a real democratization of publishing. And you'd think that could ultimately be a good thing if it weren't for the fact that the more sensational content could be, the more it would just take over the entire algorithm. Enter the grifters, those with no shame, no rules, no training in media or journalism, no ethical restraints, and a simple desire to make as much money as they possibly could. Think what you want about mainstream corporate journalism, I mean, I certainly do, but at least they have rules, and there are consequences for journalists who break those rules. Someone who just makes up details of a story or invents sources, for example, will quickly find themselves out of a job and probably ostracized from the field altogether. But random assholes on the internet don't have this problem. They can say whatever they want, and they do, in order to get their content in front of as many people as they possibly can. Because again, money. We have a lot of evidence that backs up certain conclusions in the digital media space. For instance, conservative media is really killing it, and I kind of also mean that in a literal sense, but you'd have to watch my other video on where political violence in America is coming from to get that whole story. The reasons for this were confusing for a very long time, but there are a couple of strong possible solutions. One is something I've repeated very often in training my own direct reports inside media operations, and that is that stories and headlines that elicit strong emotional responses have the best chances of going viral. And there is no stronger emotion than outrage. Hate, fear, jealousy, all the most negative reactionary emotions, those are the ones that get clicks. We know from the research that right-wing rhetoric is increasingly more violent and incites strong negative emotions. We've also seen and done experiments that have confirmed and even reconfirmed recently that the fear centers of right-leaning people are larger and more active. So you put those two together and you have yourself a succotash. But I think the main takeaway here is that any of us are susceptible to rage bait. Every other headline these days is designed to anger you about something your political opposition is doing, something outrageous, and get you to click and stay glued to the page for as long as possible so that outlet can make money from the ad placements. Just a reminder to please like this video and subscribe to the channel if you like the information that I'm dishing out. It'll go a really long way towards supporting the growth of a meaningful movement for truth. And some people, I realize, may disagree with my thoughts on this because the ad revenue model of journalism and online media is showing a lot of cracks right now, and it doesn't actually really work very well. And while that's completely true, it doesn't change the fact that everyone alive is trying to make money on the internet this way, because there really aren't any other viable options. And this is just how things are set up now. It certainly isn't viable for major news networks who've hit their ceiling, but the model does work all the way until it doesn't. And one really important thing to point out is that it really works for independent actors. Random people on the internet can have gigantic misinformation empires that make them filthy rich by spewing absolute nonsense on the internet that people then really start to believe. These operations can be as complex or as simple as you want. The fact is that one person can run the whole thing. I've known people who have done this, who have giant SEO empires about like all kinds of stuff that they just make money from. I've heard about tons more where just a single person made a killing from running sites just like this. NPR covered one of these cases way back in 2016 when the uproar over fake news was at a fever pitch. They tracked down the owner of a disinformation operation to the suburbs of Los Angeles. This story is fascinating, and I really suggest that you read it. The link is down in the didgeridoo with the rest of my sources. Justin Kohler, a registered Democrat, created a series of fake news sites catering to the extreme right wing and made upwards of $30,000 a month as of 2016. Then there are the more organized actors, some of them even state-sponsored, and they get resources from governments that are hostile to American democracy. I'm not going to relitigate the Russian interference into the 2016 election because we have the data and it's all out there proving that Russian assets went into creating massive disinformation empires to turn the tide of public perception. But one infamous Macedonian disinformation cell that was included in this was run by a group of teenagers, and it became a real focus in the years following the election. You can read about that below, including testimony from some of the writers and creators who worked on some of those sites, and the effect that it had on the information ecosystem. We had thought for a long time that it was just sort of a spontaneously created group by a bunch of teens who were looking to cash in on the new fake news gold rush made possible by ad revenue. But more recently, we've tracked down the very rich Macedonian lawyer who partnered with some high-profile US Republicans, including one former candidate for the Nevada State Assembly. They created and supported this Macedonian disinformation cell, and the rest is history. Not that this is really confusing or that mysterious at all, but just because data and the pursuit of truth is important and vital to the success of this channel and very meaningful to me, I'm going to point out the research on this. A study from Stanford University published last year in the journal Nature confirmed every detail of this entire process. Not only can someone make a ton of money spreading misinformation on the internet, the way the ad buying process works, companies aren't even aware that their ad dollars are going toward buying space on false or even radicalizing content. Because most of the ad space is sold programmatically through the automated bids and on an automatic exchange. There's just no possible way for anyone to keep track of where all the company's ads are going before you find yourself funding something potentially terrible. It reminds me a little bit of the global antiquities market. Lots of the most preeminent cultural institutions have been found to purchase and display objects that, when investigating their provenance, have accidentally come from looting operations run by terrorist cells like Al-Qaeda. Oops. I think everyone just kind of turns a blind eye to this whole thing because money. Fun story, but I guess they could put down those dismantled rare Buddhist artifacts now because they can just make radicalizing content online and make all their money that way instead. Okay, so to sum up, we have a problem with increasingly polarizing rhetoric that leads to increasingly more disturbing actions. And like everything else everywhere else, it's driven by greed. Like Justin Kohler, the guy in the California suburbs who created his own right-wing misinformation empire. When interviewed by NPR, it was found that eventually he was planning on blowing the lid off the whole thing and announcing that everything he was writing was nonsense. But he said the lies just spread too fast, and they made too much money. The grifters you see spreading misinformation might not even be in ideological agreement with the side they're pandering to. I think that's really important to keep in mind as we continue to think about how we're all manipulated by the system. We also have larger and larger networks accumulating through monopolies that are systemically in pursuit of as much profit as possible, all putting out similar content to compete with everyone else for views. And AI content is only making the whole situation worse, because now one individual can run a whole website filled with AI content or several sites or video channels all by themselves, and the content is complete nonsense, but it pays, so what do they care? For big companies and major news organizations, there is a ceiling for the amount of money to be made by this. And a lot of big companies have gone under or gone through round after round of layoffs because at a certain point, the ad revenue model of digital content is no longer sustainable. So it turns out that this is a big problem for the public and also a big problem for businesses too. In light of that, what can we possibly do about it? Personally, I have two proposed solutions, and I think one is that we could have a more robust public media funded by tax dollars. I think NPR and PBS are wonderful, but they get the bulk of their funding through individual donations. And that's not ideal, because we want everyone to have access to news that can't be swayed one way or the other, and that's only interested in facts and data. And that's only possible, in my opinion, if everyone is responsible for paying for it. The issue with this solution is that we're going to have a lot of arguments about who exactly gets to handle oversight of this. In my opinion, it should be the people who study journalism and political science and who have several degrees in the fields and lots of published research. But honestly, I also think the experts should be in charge of pretty much every field, since literally no one else knows more than they do on a particular topic. The second solution that's top of mind for me is already happening, and that's more independent journalism. Not only do we have tons of regular concerned citizens making YouTube channels and Substacks, we have a lot of professional journalists who've been been fired for speaking out, who are now taking up prominent positions in the cultural narrative using these various media. There are growing networks of independent writers and thinkers and scientists and philosophers and more, all sprouting up to take the place that corporate media once had a stranglehold on. There was a time when I was very hesitant about this new reality, but it's getting really, really clear as we look at current events that the corporate media is very intent on appeasement. And instead of reporting factual information and upholding its obligation to the truth and to accountability, it's pandering more and more to the current administration. So if you've been wondering where the polarization of America has come from, if it seems like it came out of nowhere for you, I think I have a fairly convincing lead to point to. I think that the ad revenue model of journalism is the underlying cause of radicalization across party lines. And I think we're going to have really complex discussions about freedom of speech in America and whether or not freedom of speech equates to freedom of reach. And I do think it's going to be excruciatingly difficult to fix all this. But I do think that we have a few threads to pull on. So let's pull on those threads and do some good wherever we personally can in the world. And I'll see you next time.